episode of Everything You Need Is Inside. I am so excited to welcome my mentor and teacher and friend, Christina Allen, who has been probably the most impactful human on my journey thus far in the past 2+ years. And I don't know how I could ever thank you enough for standing in that space for me and holding space for me and teaching me and guiding me, and also holding space for friends through their experiences. So thank you.
You're welcome.
But when I asked Christina how she would introduce herself, particularly at a cocktail party, if you're at a cocktail party, your answer is?
I probably wouldn't go around introducing myself.
Why? Why not?
Because I tend to be a little on the introverted side.
Yeah.
I am not a big hello, here I am person.
Right. And if you were to say, like, I'm a shaman, people would say, like, huh?
Oh, gosh, that word is so loaded.
Yeah.
I don't ever say I'm a shaman.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting word. Even now when I speak of you, I think I call you a healer and I call you a shaman. And I also sometimes preface it like, I know this sounds weird, but she's my shaman. So I can imagine how it feels to say it as the shaman.
Yeah, and it's considered an honorific. It's not considered something you claim as your own.
Okay.
So you saying I'm a shaman works, but for me to go like, I'm a shaman,
Yeah.
in a lot of circles is a little, egoic and boastful. I don't not do it because of that, but just I don't need that label.
Right.
I just show up and do my work.
Yeah.
And because there's so much, dissonance about that word, some people say you can't use it, some people say it means only a specific thing. There's a lot of, controversy about that word. It's very loaded. So I, for the most part, avoid it. However, I did name my company Austin Shamanic Center, so I get kind of caught in that. But the reason I did is because you need some word that our culture doesn't have to talk about healing, where you're going into another space, where you're helping somebody heal from the subconscious, and working with at more of a spiritual level. And it's not just psychic healing, so that doesn't really fit. It comes from these shamanic traditions. And, so that's...
Christina is the founder, creator of Austin Shamanic Center. And I like that you mentioned that. That's important because you did call your company that.
I did. And better for worse.
Right. And it's also such a bold name, I would say. And I don't actually know that you can even put words around the work that you do. It has impacted my life so intensely in every which way. And as I've come to know you more, I've seen why I've been so drawn to you, and there being so many interesting parallels in your journey and mine, and your background in yoga and owning studios in California, and your own history. And I think because you've walked the path of healing yourself, it's given you the opportunity to really hold space for people in their own journey. And I think that's my number one high praise for you, of always showing up relatable. Because I know that in my work and, even just in common conversation, people want to be seen, they want to be heard. And if you've done that work yourself, you create that space where there is no separation. So thank you for doing that.
You're welcome. I sort of was forced to, but, to heal, right? And I think that to hold space for somebody, you have to have experienced that. So I don't recommend you go out and, just create trauma for yourself, but I think that is sort of the, the gift that I get from having had a pretty traumatic childhood, is that I can go into some pretty dark places and hold somebody without feeling discomfort. I can, hold emotional dysregulation. I can hold all kinds of spaces where people normally can't. I actually thought that that everyone could hold those spaces until I would reach out to other people, and they're like, "Oh, have you taken your medication?"
Which one?
I'm like, "Oh, never mind. I'll work this out."
I remember at some point in my path with you, I was on your table, which we'll talk about the work that you do. And at some point I was like, I'm a puffer fish, because I used to think to be big and be loud. And I think sort of a byproduct of trauma is that you sometimes take on this role of being big, loud, seen, when you've taught me you don't need to be big, loud, and seen. You just already are that energy. And given that that was being fed by you, you're a petite woman, but the space that you hold is so incredibly vast, like not in this realm or only in this realm. And learning from you by the work that we've done together, and also just by being your student, it's become so clear that that's the truth. That to really like stand in your space and hold your boundaries and be grounded, it has nothing to do with what you look like. It's really just energetics.
Yeah. It is, and just your confidence, because you've been through so much. Yeah. One of the interesting premises of shamanic healing or shamanic learning, training to be a shaman, is your truths are experiential. It's not something you read out of a book. People are always asking me, well, what book can I read? And like, you can read any book you want to about shamanism, but it's going through the fire that teaches you what it is, that teaches you how to heal, that teaches you how to hold that space, how to get out of that space, how to get out of those dark places.
Yeah, I love that. I think that I learn by doing. Someone can tell me a million times not to or to, and it's similar to like, I learned to cook by cooking. It wasn't culinary school. Like, I learned to run a business by running a business. Like, as we both know, running studios or even practicing yoga or teaching yoga, you learn to teach by teaching. Yeah. So it's interesting. And again, like with the word shamanism, it does hold both, it's a double entendre, because it could be seen as like shamanism in this day and age of this new age spirituality. But when it's really used in a proper setting or in the word, like whatever it means, I just know that like, in my experience working with you, you've taken me to other planets just through breath, just through energetics moving through the body. And even in learning from you in the courses I've taken with you, I would spend hours doing the work with you and then leave and be so energetically depleted because it took so much energy to use the energy and to honor that energy and to hold space. And I think that just speaks to the process of healing as a whole. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not. No. So I know that we've done, if you haven't heard my original podcast with Christina, we recorded last August, I believe.
Is that when it was?
And I believe so much has changed and shifted since then. And we really went deep into your background. And with that, if you could just speak to how you got here. How did you, you didn't read books, so, you probably read
I did
many
read
books. Yeah, but how did you become this person who holds expansive space and really heals? What did that look like? Cliff notes.
Yeah, well, I think it comes from trauma. I think the earliest major trauma that I think I had, like birth trauma, and I had another trauma as a baby. Both of those have popped for me as an adult. But I had this repressed memory of something that happened to me when I was 4, when my grandmother broke my collarbone and put me in my room all night and pretended in the morning like I had fallen out of bed and broken it. And so there is a 4-year-old kid who spent an entire night in a room in pain, not feeling safe because my grandmother was taking care of me. My parents were out of town. And so there were no caretakers that I could turn to for solace, no caretakers I could turn to for help. And I think I developed some sense of that room as a place, as a safe place, as a place that I almost take people, as a part of my interior construct. So in hindsight, what I think I do is I hold this dark room that I know how to hold that room. I held that room. And just, I think the other thing that happens when you have trauma like that is you dissociate, you go out of your body. And so you start to explore the realms outside of the physicality. You start to be able to explore that bigger space, that space that's bigger than just your personality. And actually your personality and your body and your ego are not that fun to be in because it's the one that's processing the pain and putting it all together. So there's this sense of being able to hold this space that's way out here. I didn't know I could really hold that. I knew I was called to be a healer for a long time, and I finally, in my 40s, went to shaman school, and that's where I really learned how to hone the already kind of implicit pieces that I had and turn them into a skill set.
So interesting. And I know that from an early age, though, not 4, but at some point in your teens, like, you kind of wanted to explore this world. how did that just showed up for you and you kind of were like, you didn't know how to get there? What did that look like?
Yeah, I had another trauma at 15 where my dad attacked me, and it was really scary because I'm a little person and he was a big guy, and he was enraged. He was out of his mind. It didn't have anything to do with me, but I was the person there that he took it out on. Mm-hmm. And that was about the same time that I was getting into psychedelics. I was going to Grateful Dead concerts. I lived in California, and I was having these experiences with altered states and realizing that when I went into these altered states, which probably wasn't that different than the dissociation state on some level, but I didn't make the connection yet, I felt better. I felt more integrated. Mm-hmm. I felt more whole. And then I started going, okay, what is reality? Because my grandmother told me that I had fallen out of bed and I had hurt myself and put it all on me and lied to my parents and told them that, I struggled with what reality was. Mm-hmm. Because I was living a lie. Right. And I didn't know how to say I was living a lie. I just repressed the whole thing. It was too complicated. And so I was looking for truth. I had this really strong mission, like, what is truth? And when I would go on these psychedelics, I would have this sense of, oh, this is reality. This is the real reality. You can see the fabric of reality. You know, there's information in the, you know, the curlicues of space and all that kind of thing. So I thought, okay, how do I work with this? This is my strong suit. This is where I feel most at home. And I read a lot of books because that's all I had. You know, I was some young chick in the suburbs, in the white suburbs. Mm-hmm. And I read a lot of the Carlos Castaneda books, which were about shamanism in Mexico. And I was like, that's it, because he was doing a lot of psychedelics and having these, you know, these experiences in other worlds and all this kind of stuff. I'm like, that's what I'm supposed to do. I can feel it in my bones. But how are you going to get there? Right. How are you going to get there from, you know, like some upper middle class high school in Sacramento, California to...
Is that what when yoga came in, was it like because you're working with energy or through the body, it had nothing related to, like, was it the simplest connection or no? Like, or I also know that you studied physics and science. So what was you were reading these books and then you wanted to work with energy. So what was your next thing?
My next thing was I had to go to college because that's what you do when you're my parents' child. And so I went to college and I fumbled through lots of different majors. Psychology seemed like it might be a way to go. Right. But it was too sort of linear and a lot of experiments on dogs and...
Christina has a really big dog. It's not really a dog. It's more like a bear. It's called Kuma.
Yeah, so that wasn't going to work for me. I didn't have Kuma at that time, but, you know, I'd had dogs and cats. And I wasn't, you know, the psychology wasn't quite... felt too... contained for where I wanted to go. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't really know what to do. I decided I'm going to be a creative writing major. So I started doing that for a little while. And just fumbled around in the humanities for a while. Mm-hmm. And then I used to work for my dad. My dad lived in Alaska. And I would go out into the Brooks Range, into the, you know, the Northern Circle and work. And cook, be a cook's helper, run camps for geologists and drillers and people looking for coal and that kind of thing up there. And I would just be the sole person up there running these little camps. And I had these really big moments with the mountains up there, Denali in particular. And I was watching these guys get flown around in helicopters, and their summer was like living in these big tents, and, you know, like there were women and men. And I thought, well, that's something I could do. I could go back to school, because I had taken some time off from school because I just, you know, I bounced around and just finally went, I don't know what to do. Right. So I spent the summer working in one of these camps, had sort of this real moment with nature where I felt like, yes, I like this. And then I loved riding around in the helicopters. That was pretty fun. And I thought, well, I'll go back and be a geologist. That's what I'll do. And so I went back to school, got back enrolled, started doing all the prereqs for geology, and one of them was physics. And I had been reading all kinds of Eastern philosophy, the Tao, all about Taoism and things like that. And then while I was studying physics, I read this book called The Tao of Physics. and it started relating spirituality to the quantum field. And I was like, oh, the quantum field is the psychedelic field. And I started to go, oh, now we're starting to hone in on what it is that I think really is important in reality, what reality really is. And I thought, and I was doing okay in my physics classes. I was doing well, and I thought, no, I'm going to do this. I'm just going to get my degree in physics because it's the most shamanic thing I can come up with.
Right. That makes sense.
Right, that made sense.
Yeah.
And so I was never designed to be a physicist.
Right. I mean, that would be fun at this point.
Yeah, it wasn't my place, but it was a great education, and I did get a lot of value out of learning to critically think. Learn about quantum mechanics, learn about the nature of reality, all that kind of stuff is something I completely take with me still to this day. So I started with physics.
Right.
Then I worked in the world of physics for a while, and I like, oh, I don't really like this. It's all oscilloscopes and, cement rooms and, and I'm like, computers, not really my thing.
Right. Not like feeling, like there was an emotion attached to it.
Not
it was
a lot,
like the
no.
far out. So in that, you mentioned this word dissociation versus the psychedelic world. So were you present in that experience, or were you dissociate? Like, was it just going through the motions, or you were intrigued by what you were doing?
When I was working in physics?
Yeah, in labs.
It depends. I mean, I could apply myself and do really well with my hands.
Yeah.
If I'm doing, I can focus and I could do stuff. But I also felt overwhelmed. I had imposter syndrome, like I'm not supposed to be here.
Yeah.
And so I just had this sense of, this isn't where I'm supposed to be. This isn't me. And so I felt a lot of anxiety,
I love that you just mentioned that, because I think that depression, anxiety, imposter syndrome, ADHD, whatever you want to call it, the symptoms show up. And so often they're just symptoms of like actually what's disintegrated inside. So you weren't feeling like you were in the right space, just that truth, that little voice that we all have. But, it's showing up as anxiety or imposter syndrome. So I think that such a big takeaway for people, and a question I get often, and I ask often, is how do you learn to trust yourself? And for me, it's just like flexing that muscle over and over again of like saying yes when I mean yes and no when I mean no, holding the boundaries, which is something I had to learn. But otherwise, it's me dissociating, so I don't have to be where I am. And I think that takes you out of the trust. So I think we should probably talk to dissociation. What does dissociation mean for those that don't know?
Well, it's a psychological term, which means you've separated sort of into two states. I don't actually, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know exactly how they would define it. In my experience with people who I've worked with who've dissociated, I always find that their consciousness, how they're perceiving reality, is not embodied. It's outside their body. So it's like they're in, like Major Tom, ground control to Major Tom. Here I am in a tin can, like it's like they're circling their body, but they're not in their body. And so I'll ask them. I know somebody's dissociated because I'll say, tell me about when this first happened. What do you feel? And they're like, I don't know. I don't really feel anything, because they're not in their body. They can't feel it in their body. And so I go, okay, so first step is we got to get them back in their body. So that's how dissociation shows up for me in my work. In the shamanic traditions, what we would say is that there was soul loss, that a part of your soul actually was like, I'm not going to stick around for the rest of the story, and goes. In the shamanic traditions, it actually goes into the underworld, into the mother, into the earth, and she holds that piece until we do enough healing for that piece to come home.
Yeah, I become almost emotional when you speak to that, of like not feeling embodied. And, it's something like, if you don't know what that means, it's hard to understand it until you come back into your body. And I think part of, this journey, really this idea of everything you need is inside, it really speaks to my journey of coming back home. And the only way I finally came back home through your work and holding space, immensely, but was honoring that I wasn't home. First, you got to get to that place of realizing that something's disconnected. And I know you've spoken at length, but most people, as you just shared, didn't even know you had trauma, right? Because it's something you dissociated from, you separated from. I think it's so profound that you started to realize, at these dead shows or whatever you were doing when you were starting to play with psychedelics, that oh, well, this realm is actually where I feel more connected. And as you say that, for me, I toy with microdosing once in a while. I've never taken an antidepressant. I probably needed to be on antidepressants many times in my life. But I also came from a family of like, you're good. Like, and because I didn't even know I was depressed. I was high achieving. I was attractive. Like, I was good, on the outside.
It's actually usually a sign of trauma.
Right, exactly. Overachieving, perfectionism, hate yourself, but nobody knows that.
Yeah. So you emphasize your beauty because you have to be, you're perfect.
You have to fit in this box
Yes.
and have the perfect veneer. Yeah. So, but in my experience, both with using plant medicine and then, just toying with microdosing, and in the work that I've done, I also realize the intensity of my sensitivity. So when I microdose, I take like an eighth of a capsule or whatever else, but I feel so much more connected to self, like to not another realm, but whatever this is, I'm here, like to nature, to my body. But if I take too much, like I go on a full-blown plant medicine journey in the yoga class, and like I need to it's a lot, for the nervous system. But I think my point being that like this dissociation was almost like where I lived my whole life. Like I lived dissociated. So I want to speak to your work. So I came to Christina 2.5 years ago. I remember it was before I moved to Austin, and I had just experienced one of the most traumatic medicine journeys of my life. And it was only the third journey I'd ever done. So it was 3 months into me remembering any sort of trauma in my life. And I did a plant medicine journey while I was living in New York City. And it was on New Year's Eve, 2020 into 2021. And it was, I shook the whole time. My right leg was just, it was the ugliest journey I think I'd had at that moment. They were uglier. But it put me into such a state of shock, because after I was in this group of people and everyone was dancing and celebrating, and I was like, is it just me? Like uprooting this horrible rape from my friend's stepfather. I was 13. Like it was really what took me out of my body, and like started spinning at a very young age. And when you're a 13-year-old girl, like becoming a woman, like nothing makes sense at this point. Like, and that really put me on a hard path. So I came and I reached out to you. It was in the middle of COVID, and you have such incredible boundaries that you're like, no, you can't come to see me in person. Like I'm only doing Zoom. And I was like, why would I talk to someone on Zoom when I'm in the same city as them? Like, and I wasn't having it. And so it wasn't our time. So fast forward, I think probably 3 months later when I moved here and I came for the first session, or no, I started seeing you on Zoom because it was still COVID. And within like the first or second session, the first session was incredibly emotional, and I felt seen and heard by someone who wasn't a therapist, talking about trauma, and also not even talking. The therapy that I experienced, it was me talking. But then with you, I was like heard. And I was heard by someone who understood what I was talking about and wanted to help. And we went into session like through breath work and you moving energy. And I think by the second experience I had with you, like over Zoom, I passed out over Zoom, over the computer. So I was like, I don't know what this woman is doing, but not only do I feel seen and heard, something is just not what I've ever experienced. So can you take us through that? What happens?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'll say about COVID is we breathe together,
Right.
face to face.
Right.
So that's not really a good COVID activity, given it is, transmitted through breath. So yeah, definitely strong boundaries on that. I got a lot of flack from people on that, but I have to live, I have to make a living. So if I get sick, I'm down. Yeah. So yeah, strong boundaries are part of healing, I think. But it's fascinating to me. People go, this doesn't work on Zoom. How could it work on Zoom? It works on Zoom because there is no time and space in the energetic realm. I'm where you are. I'm connecting to you. That's what's important. So in my work, on Zoom or not on Zoom, I listen to your story. You tell me what's going on. You tell me what the presenting problem is. I listen, and then I ask questions. And I feel like I'm sort of one of those hound dogs. Like, let me have the smelly sock, and I'll find who the owner is.
How old they are, what they're wearing, what they did last night. You're literally MacGyver and sleuth of all the sleuths.
It's funny. It's part of the training of being a shaman is to track. It's called tracking. And so when we do that breath work, we start to build rapport. We start to sync together. And then I can just kind of lean into your energy field that has all the information of who you are and what you've done. And the parts that are relevant will just start popping to me. I'll just start seeing them. They're not necessarily going to pop to you because your intellect has been there, done that, we're done, we're moving on. And we repress a ton of what happens to us because it's not relevant. We have to move on. We have to live our lives. But then it's still down there rumbling in what we call shadow. It's still unresolved. And it's because it's unresolved, if someone comes along that can see that young version of yourself, they're like, hey, I'm down here. So I just show up and I'll get these young versions of people just going, I'm five, and this is what happened. They don't necessarily tell me the whole story. They'll tell me cues, they'll give me cues. And I've found over the years, I used to tell people like the whole story, and then maybe, more often than not I was right, but then sometimes I wasn't right, and then we'd have to get into an argument about whether it was right or wrong, and it would diffuse the whole thing. So I finally just started going, I'm just going to take you to the event, and I'm going to hold that space, and we're going to hover. I regress you back to that age, and we're going to hover over that little part of you and see if that part comes through. And what happens, if I say that when we're doing breath, that part that's in your unconscious, your subconscious, in your soul, but isn't conscious, starts to become accessible to you. If we hadn't done the breath work and run energy, the running energy part is really an important part, and we can talk about that. But if we hadn't done all that, then it would just be, remember when you were 5? And you go, I don't remember when I was 5. But when we start doing the breath work and running the energy work, we can go back in time to that 5-year-old self and hover over her. And then because she's been waiting so long to tell her story, she just unearths it. She just comes through with all her feelings. She's stuck down there, stuck in time at that age, wanting to be seen and heard and wanting to process her thing. But somebody wasn't able to, you weren't able to process it at 5, let's say. So you just had to do what you had to do to move on. And she's stuck. She's frozen in time.
Yeah. And it's interesting, even you saying that right now, it sort of just brings up, recent experiences I've had in relating to other people, and I feel they're stuck 5-year-old or 6-year-old, and I trigger that in them or whatever, it's triggered, and all of a sudden they become defensive or angry or just show up frantic in a way, and it's really not about me at all. It's that frozen stuck energy that's showing up saying like, see me, like listen to me, hear me. And I think so many of us live in these frozen states. Yeah. And then the reaction, the trigger, the behaviors that are sort of outlandish or explosive are from that stuck energy in those ages.
Absolutely. That's what shadow is. Shadow is the subconscious and the unconscious part of our mind, part of our psyche, part of our soul. Those are sort of all synonymous words. The part that we're not aware of, the part that we have stuffed because it's inconvenient, because it doesn't work, because it sabotages us. However, if it's not worked with, it's like a jack-in-the-box. It's just a matter of time. Dun, 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 dun. It's just a matter of time before it gets triggered. And if you get triggered, it means you go from 0 to 100 on an emotional scale. Your adrenaline kicks in. You're like, ah! And you know something's going on, but you don't know what it is. Right. And that just tells you there's some unresolved unconscious or subconscious piece there. It doesn't mean you're bad. It doesn't mean that person that you're talking to is dangerous. It means something in your unconscious or your subconscious has been triggered.
Right.
For me, that's always hallelujah, another piece to work, because the more you work your triggers, the less minefields there are, the less you're going to get thrown off kilter and be thrown out.
Yeah, but I think the thing with triggers is that because there's so much of this frozen energy or these pieces of us that are fragmented or dissociated, that so often we live in this numb phase of like something's uncomfortable, so we're going to drink it away, or we're going to run it away, or we're going to sext it away, or we're going to date it away, or Netflix it away. And so the triggers, they just become almost muted. Like, so they pop up, but like we know how to like put them back really easily, and I think that they get bigger. But in my whole experience, like I was a runner. I was constantly, something made me uncomfortable, so I would just like dash out. And I never knew what it was until I started unearthing, because at some point I was so frozen. Everything in my life was so stuck. Nothing was working, and I had like the higher consciousness, or I believe, God planted in me like, okay, it's time. Like we're ready. And I started looking under the hood and like dusting out, what you call the empty motel, that what happens when a motel gets abandoned, like the cockroaches, they crawl in. So when I came to you, I was just chock full of fucking cockroaches, which gave you like lots of exciting work. But I think when I talk about healing, and I preface it of saying like I had no idea that it was going to be. I think it's life work in a lot of ways. Not to say like you're always broken, you need to fix whatever, but like you said, trigger pops up and there's something else you can learn about yourself instead of suppress it. But for me, really focusing the last 2.5 years of my life in a way of like almost being in this like vortex tunnel of like putting myself back together again without ever knowing prior that there was anything wrong, because looked dandy and like happy enough and successful enough and from a really nice place. So when people show up on your doorstep now Zoom also, she works through Zoom. What's going on?
With them?
Yeah, like they are, because also, I could ask you like, how do you know you have trauma? But like both questions. So do people know they have trauma, or is it just something is disintegrated? Or because I think trauma is such a tricky word. I've had these conversations a lot of like, if you don't know at 5 that that's bad, you just stuff it down and you get frozen in that space and your memory forgets it because it's protecting you. So people come to you when they're feeling disintegrated or something's blocked.
So I'm going to back it up into a less personal space just for a minute to talk about hypervigilance. Great. Because this is what we normalize. So that 5-year-old does know something's wrong, but they don't have any resources. So they stuff the memory and try and get on with things. But because they have not dealt with it, 2 things happen. One, they become hypervigilant. They start to be overly aware of their environment, which is the secondary thing, which runs this just chronic anxiety. And the chronic anxiety is what drives all the addictions, what drives the running, which drives the sex, which drives the food intake, which drives something to quell the anxiety, make it stop, make it stop, make it stop. And we don't go, what happened to my 5-year-old? We go, how can I make this anxiety go away? So people come to my door going, how can I make this anxiety go away? Or I can't concentrate, or I have this, it's a symptom that's way, way, way up above the 5-year-old. And so I ask questions like, where does it start? When does it happen? What's your history of it? How long ago did it first start happening? And we start to go into what was going on in your life when that happened. And all this is just talk. And then what happens is they get triggered.
Okay. And then you're like, there's the popcorn.
That's where we are.
Right, yeah.
That's our portal in. Because once they get triggered, now we're in it. Now we're in the thing that their subconscious is going, here it is again, here it is again. And they're not very happy about being triggered, but they are, because they came to heal. Right. And so the way I see it is that trigger is a portal in. And so that's when I switch from talking to getting on the table. And then we start running energy and we start doing breath work. And that's when I can start to track into your subconscious. That's when you're more likely to let me in, because we've opened up that doorway into the subconscious. Before that, the person's going to fight me. They're going to go, no, I'm fine. I'm good. Everything's great. I've had people come in and tell me that. I'm like, why are you here then?
I still fight you. You
do?
Well, no, I resist getting on the table. And like I'll smoke toad venom and like go to the ether. But like to get on the table, it's like, fuck. And I know. And then you're talking to me about like the fire and the attachment. And then I'm in the crib. And then like everything blows up. And then, it's an incredible space to be in. It's incredible for you to be able to go that way. But, I think also it takes a lot of courage then to show up and be willing to go there, And also like incredible strength for you to hold people in that, because I know that the stories you hear are just, and the stories that you've lived are painful, really painful.
Yeah, and this is the trickiest part, is it takes trust. And a lot of trauma destroys trust.
Right.
And so I have to sync with that person and go as slowly as they want to go. And there's often this gatekeeper that's like, you're not fucking getting in. And I'm like, okay, I'm not going anywhere you don't want me to go. And I'll establish trust with the person until they go, okay, all right, maybe you can come in. Yeah. And sometimes when I find their 5-year-old or whatever it is, at first they won't recognize it. At first they'll go, they'll still go into their intellect and they'll go, I don't remember anything happened at 5, because they're still in defense. And what the breath does is it gets them into what's called a theta state. It gets them into a slightly altered trance state where they can open up into their subconscious, where they can remember their stuff. It's not just me saying this happened to you. It's me opening up that space so we can journey into it. Right. So we can go back to 5 and we can go, here's 5. What do we need to do about 5? And what's cool about it is that 5-year-old had no resources. But I'm going back to 5, and I'm taking your adult self back to 5, and that 5-year-old now has 2 adults that care and are seeing her and are holding her and are letting her cry and yell and scream and whatever she needs to do, say her words. So there is a healing. It's also sort of retro, going back in time. Like we're going back and helping that child, deal with however it got frozen, unfreezing it so that it can. So there's 2 ways to talk about freeze: unfreezing it from time. But then another way of talking about freeze is the neurological freeze that we go into, which is actually something biological where your body goes into paralysis as a stress response. Right. And they often go hand in hand. You went into freeze. 5-year-old stayed stuck in it. The rest of you moved on, and the rest of you goes in and out of freeze. Every time your brain rewires and goes, oh. So the other thing that I did after I studied physics is I went on to graduate school and studied neuroscience. I went to a graduate program, PhD program, studied how the brain works, how the nervous system works, studied anxiety and depression, studied learning and memory. So all that stuff actually feeds into the shamanic work that I do. So if you look at the stress response, your brain actually starts to rewire itself for going, okay, we might be having to deal with these things pretty regularly. We're going to have a system for this. And if it's something that's bigger than you, when you're a child, just about everything's bigger than you. You can't really outrun it. Right. And you can't really fight it. And the, fight, flight, and the last one is freeze. Right. So you're going to have to freeze. And freeze is the last choice because you're going to have to endure it. And the only way you can endure it is by leaving your body and watching it from a witness perspective.
Which is dissociation.
Yeah.
I mean, everything that you say, it rings so true for my story. And I think it's almost painful to listen because, as I showed up in this world and went through my life for 30 years, I thought I was fine, but I didn't know that I had anxiety, and yet I was hypervigilant about everything. I knew everything going around me. My anxiety manifested in the need to control everything, and whether it was how I worked out, how I ate, how I moved, how I related to people, how I dated, how I everything in this, also just rooted in this deep self-hate. And I didn't know you were supposed to love yourself. What does that even mean? We're not taught those things. And also the pattern, it so often is passed down, the sugar addiction. Well, it's cool. My mom loves to bake. No, we're just feeding ourselves sugar all the time. Where does that come from? Or the anxiety around scarcity mindset or food at home or hypervigilance around work and anxiety and not sleeping. All of these things that were things that became normalized. I just thought it was normal. Children don't know what's not normal or normal. Yeah. And so I was thinking about recently, it's in sort of a strange way because, I'm very committed to my practices now, whether it's energetics, cleaning and clearing, and I learned through you and now have my own interpretations or meditation, journaling, all the things. And in your work, as you said, Pachamama or the underworld takes it and recycles it. And I call it, the pain becomes love. And I know in your tradition, Munai is the word for love, and negative energy is called Hucha, if you're curious. And so often now, I'll just lay on the floor and allow, myself to let out, to release this Hucha and bring it up to Munai and create more love. But I've become very connected to the floor. Find myself sleeping on the floor. And because at first I was I like to be close to Mother Earth. Then it was after a recent mushroom journey and, on the floor. And then as I sat with that, I was I used to sleep on my parents' floor growing up. starting at like age 6, and because I was scared to sleep in my own room at night. I was scared to be alone. And then it took me in this thought of like, why would a 6-year-old be scared at night to sleep, alone? Or why, I wanted to be near my parents on their floor. And it was because I had a very significant trauma sleeping out, at someone else's home when I was 6. But it just took me into this wonder and awe of like, how do you not like question if your child all of a sudden can't sleep? Like, I was up as a 6-year-old for decades, never sleeping, roaming the halls at night, like, because if I didn't go to sleep, I was okay. Like, no one could hurt me if I was awake. Like, I would stand my ground. And like, thankfully, I didn't experience trauma in my own home, but like outside of the home, I brought it back into the home. And I sort of wanted to just hold my 6-year-old in that space of, she was so afraid. And I lived my life for 30 years so afraid without knowing why. And even when you said in your own experience, like, your memory came up, or like maybe of this room, or it was only recently that you realized as a 4-year-old that you were attacked almost by your grandmother. You're like really embodying that memory. And for me too, of like, it would come up, the memory, but it was like, he wouldn't hurt me. Why would he hurt, And sort of, because you don't want to believe it. But you are frozen in that state. And I think so much of the work you do and what you were just explaining, it brought me to this word of like reparenting. So when people come to your table, and when I was on your table and you're talking to my 6-year-old, like, you're holding me in that space so that I feel safe with another adult, as an adult, but also as a 6-year-old that just needs to be held. Mm-hmm. So I assume you do a lot of holding, like, in that way.
Yeah, it's interesting because in therapy, you can't touch your client. In healing, I don't necessarily, go around and hug people, right. But I think sometimes a hug is necessary because it resets the nervous system. What the child is looking for is soothing, and this comes to your attachment stuff. Yeah. We can get into it more specifically later. But if you have not been held and soothed as a young baby and as a young kid, you don't have any reference point for being soothed. You have to somehow learn how to self-soothe, mm-hmm. and that's where the sugar comes in. That's where the addictions come in. That's where we start. Because what happens when you eat sugar? You feel good for a minute, right? There's all these things that, especially, and that's like kids are self-medicating with sugar. Mm-hmm. If you don't have someone to help you reset your nervous system, and I think that's what going to your parent for a hug when you fall down is all about, is they hold you and you calm down and your nervous system goes, okay, this is a one-time thing. This isn't, we don't have to reprogram ourselves for like, this is what's going to happen. But the other thing about it with parents is parents don't necessarily recognize that their child is in trauma. Right. They just think they have a difficult child, and they are dealing with their own internal resistance to the difficulty of that child. God, I can't sit down without that kid doing this, or God, I can't. They start to have resistance to the child as opposed to recognizing that there's something going on with this kid that they need help. And I think most parents aren't savvy enough to recognize trauma in their kids. My mom wasn't. Right. I know my mom knew something was wrong because I remember when I was 7 years old, she took me to a psychologist, which was a complete disaster, and she also got me a kitty cat. Mm. And the kitty cat was actually how I soothed. Like, I found that's how I have such, like, pets are a very big part of my life because they're unconditional lovers. They don't go into like, oh, you're such a burden. Oh, you're emotionally dysregulated. Oh, I can't stand you, right? Which is what all the people did in my early life, right? So,
they just bark at the UPS man.
Yeah, that's doable. Right. We can get through that. Yeah. But I think it's true, like, parents don't necessarily recognize we're in trauma, and we don't get that. We don't know that we're in trauma because we're just surviving it. And so there's a secondary sort of traumatic thing that happens is the parents start to react to the dysfunction of the child, and then push the child away, don't want to deal with the child, negate the child, criticize the child, lots of different things that they'll do, ignore the child, tell the child they're all right, you're fine, you're good, you're good to go.
You're too much. On the other one, it was like,
you're too much. But that's the whole critical side. You're too much. You're too emotional. There's a reason I'm too emotional.
Right.
My emotional system is dysregulated because I had trauma, but you don't know how to say that.
Right.
You're like, I'm just getting triggered all the time.
Yeah, and it's almost not the parents' fault because they don't know any better, and
Yeah.
they had probably had similar trauma. You know, it's like this cycle that keeps going. And
It can be.
You know, everything you say, I'm just thinking about younger version of Olivia who just needed love and was so dysregulated, was so hypervigilant, was so anxious and afraid and emotional, and often told she was too much, or that was how I was responded to or reacted to. And I just needed the attention. I just needed the love. I just needed the soothing. And so, like you said, I ended up finding other ways to self-soothe, which were often self-sabotage, especially as I got older and then the teen years, and you sort of become surrounded by all of these things that you're not prepared for.
Yes.
And they're things that dissociate you even further. So then the trauma just continues and probably gets darker and deeper, to the extent that, like, I thought this was funny. It's not funny at all. I used to say, well, if I didn't feel it, it didn't happen. And I was talking about workout classes in New York City when I was, you know, in my late 20s, because I was so dissociated from my body. You know, I could run a half marathon, box with a trainer for 90 minutes, take a hot yoga class, and not feel any of it. Like, just trained as a machine. So I would go to some class and it was like people like jumping around, and I was like this little girl, but I could like fuck shit up. So if I didn't feel it, it didn't happen. But even the fact that that was in my mind space is scary. Even to speak that and then to uncover like pretty intense sexual assault for 30 years, it's like, fuck. I just wasn't there. I found a way, because I had to protect myself at a very young age, to just leave my body to go to another space.
Yeah, that's dissociation. That's
Yeah.
freeze and dissociation.
Yeah.
And that, it's unfortunate. I think it happens to girls in particular, boys too. Boys get molested also, very, very much so. But girls tend to be sought after for sex more than guys do. Boys do. Boys tend to be more of the seeker, and girls have to choose who they're going to let in and who they're not, because they're going to make the babies. So there's a biological thing that's going out there. So there's a lot more attention on girls to get laid. And so if you have trauma, if you have stress, you're like, that's too much information. It's too much to have all these people hitting on me. And you can go into just like freeze and like, I don't know how to deal with this, and let things happen that you don't want to let happen. I'm not saying that's the rapes. That's different than rapes, but that's sort of that date rape thing of like
not the inability to even say no. It's like,
yeah,
and
you
if
can't
your
give
voice
consent.
is taken away, right? And I think it's like just even recently this past weekend, because now coming from a lens that I'm coming from where I'm integrated and I'm here and I don't want to dissociate. So like I'll have half a glass of wine maybe, but I don't feel the need. And I go to a bar and I'm just like a fly on the wall and watching like, oh, men, they'll buy you all the drinks. You know, they want you to drink. There's like a lubrication involved. And I don't want to like point fingers, but it's just this culture that we've become so accustomed to where, you know, women are sought after in a lot of ways. And there's this, you know, flirtatious thing that happens, but I don't know how much innocence is attached to it, depending on the circumstance. But it just makes me feel sad for younger me who played a part in it. You know,
yeah, and I think that's the tricky part for young girls who've had trauma, is they don't know that they want connection, they want soothing, they want to someone to adore them, someone to love them. Mm-hmm. And so if a guy pays attention to them, they're like, oh, okay, cool, he likes me. Right. And that's not necessarily true. Right. He might like you for a minute, but that's not necessarily what his agenda is. And so you end up having these sort of consensual relationships that aren't really what you wanted, and they start to affect your self-esteem.
Right.
You start to feel like trash. You start to feel like, you know, nobody likes you for who you are. Mm-hmm. It's just all that kind of stuff. And what's the unconscious thing for, I think, young women is our culture is so focused on sex and sex selling things that as young women we tend to dress provocatively. And that just fires the whole thing up. Mm-hmm. It just keeps the whole thing going. And it's never a woman's fault that those things happen. But there's also an awareness that I would say young women need to have of like,
right. How are you presenting yourself to the world?
Yeah.
Because whatever you're presenting is being reflected back.
Right. If you lead with your sexuality, guess what people are going to be interested in?
Right.
Your sexuality.
And that's something I think I needed to learn too, of like embracing myself as a woman and owning my sexuality in a way that like was never mine. And so like taking it back, but then like realizing that I don't need to or want to lead with that. Because if I lead with that, that's what's going to, meet me. And I think it undervalues like our prowess as women, like our power, and it really breaks down our boundaries and I think our self-worth at some point. And not to say that like not embracing your beauty or honoring yourself as this goddess, like, as all women are and all humans are, but to really know your intention behind what you're doing. Like if it's dressing a certain way to get the attention that you're lacking, then that's coming from a place of need instead of just like knowing who you are.
Exactly.
Which is, like I said too, like watching a fly on the wall now from this different space of experiencing this, I just want to hold these girls and I feel very kin to, you don't need to do that, baby girl. Like you're beautiful. You don't need to do that. And on the other side of that, hearing conversations with men leading with like, this is what I do. This is what I have. This is how much money I make. I'll take you on my boat, like cool it, like killer. Like if that's how you're presenting yourself too, then you're going to attract a woman who just wants you for that. Mm-hmm. So it's really like, how are we showing up? And, and how are we so detached from our hearts that we're just leading with this ego, this darkness, this shadow side that feels inadequate?
Because we're all in trauma.
Right. We're all in trauma.
So many people are. I mean, it's really uncanny. I mean, a good friend of mine is a social worker, and I worked with her at one point, and she said everyone experiences trauma. It's just whether you have processed it or not.
Right.
And it's all. And if you haven't processed it, then you're going to be stuck with some of these deep wounds. Mm-hmm. If you have processed it in real time, if you had parents that were like, let me hold you, little Susie, I got you, you're okay, like picked you up, I got you, and soothe that nervous system back down, then that kid gets back on their feet and gets on their bike and just, pedals off.
Right.
But if there's no one to, and that's again, we can talk about attachment, but that's one of the other things that can happen is if you have a parent who's not able to attach well, who can't connect with you well, and it's your primary source of connection, you're going to have that experience of not being soothed, of not having your trauma, soothed and your nervous system reset. Yeah. And so you're going to go around with a frazzled nervous system forever.
Right. And I think that's like what the armor starts building. It gets lacquered on and layered on. And I, again, talking to like young Olivia, I think I felt lonely my whole life. And how that showed up was just so strong and so fierce and so tough. And from an external point of view, but it was like just deep isolation inside. Never feeling understood, always feeling like an outsider. But I played the role well because like I had a lot of friends, but like I didn't really let anybody in. I'm really feeling alone in this traumatized state without knowing why and without any real like conscious memory of why. And as you mentioned, attachment, and I just keep thinking of like if you're soothed by a parent or you're held, like as you mentioned, like not chakras, but in your school of work called nyawis, like the attachments are through your belly or through the umbilical cord or through the gut. When you stay frozen in these traumatic state or traumatized state, the one thing that came to my mind is like it freezes in you. So like that deeply affects your digestive system. It affects the way that your body functions. If you have these frozen parts of you that sort of get stuck. And I think, I don't know, but I would assume when people come to you, their bodies are dysregulated. Mm-hmm. So often,
Yeah, I mean, the primary thing that's dysregulated is their nervous system.
Yeah.
And the nervous system runs everything else. Right? So what happens when you have repeated trauma is you become hypervigilant. Right. And so there's this little part of your brain in the front of it called the amygdala that anticipates danger. Danger hasn't even happened yet. It's like, it's going to happen, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And the more trauma you've had, the more hypervigilant it becomes. And it feeds back to this part of your brain called the hippocampus, which is all about learning and memory. And the hippocampus reaches over there and says, hypothalamus, drop some stress response into the body. Let's get going. We need to fight or flight. We need some adrenaline in the system. We need to be ready for anything. And if you can't fight, and if you can't flight, that adrenaline freezes in your muscles. It freezes the whole thing down, and you're in a state of paralysis, and you can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
And so the more trauma you have, the more you go into freeze. And if you're in freeze, all you can do is sort of watch from the outside as what's going down goes down.
Yeah.
And so everything starts to become dysregulated. Your moods start to become dysregulated. You have depression because you feel helpless. Here's one of the things: the self-esteem piece and the self-loathing piece come from freeze. I think they come from not being able to champion yourself.
Right.
They come from not being able to say no. Back off.
Right.
This isn't okay with me. I'm setting boundaries. Because if you can't do that because you're afraid you're going to go into freeze, or because you go into freeze, nobody knows your no.
Right. And then you keep like throwing yourself under the bus because you can't stand up for yourself.
Yeah.
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 And I think that's like, you become the ultimate people pleaser. And you see it all the time, just common every day. Like, people just say yes when it's like, why are you saying yes when you don't mean yes? And that would make sense then, that you sort of lose that faith in self if you're constantly saying yes when you mean no.
Yeah, and not even lose faith in yourself, you start to hate yourself.
Right.
Like, I don't have the strength to say a single word. I can't just stand up for myself. How good of a human being am I if I can't even stand up for myself?
Yeah.
And then you go into codependency. I'm going to need somebody that can protect me. And then you got this whole codependency kind of thing going on.
Right.
And you hate yourself because you have to rely on someone.
And you hate them because you're relying on them.
Yeah, and there's this whole kind of thing, that self-loathing, low self-esteem that come from not being able to speak your truth, not being able to set your boundaries, not being able to be authentic and respectful of your own self. And when you can't respect yourself, it's easier just to let it happen.
Right.
Then you start to hate yourself.
And let it happen and be like, whatever, it was no big deal, when like it was a really big deal.
Yeah.
But you keep telling your nervous system it wasn't a big deal, so then it keeps happening and it's never a big deal. When I think about, when I was running or owned studios in New York City, and I really built something, when I look at it now, like pretty wild, like no experience, made it up, but it was impactful for me and I wanted to help others. But I didn't see myself in that space, in that light. I didn't see myself as the boss, even though it was like my own investment from like stock I sold that my parents had bought me when I was 4. Like, it was really like so from the ground up. And because I didn't see myself in that, nobody else did. Mm-hmm. And employees walked all over me, stole from me. It was just, and I let it happen. And each time it happened, I think, in my subconscious, I was like, fucking pathetic.
Yep.
And it was just this sadness, and I would let in a lot of ways abuse me, like verbally, and in so many ways. And it just kept me feeling worthless. And then not dissimilar from like pretty borderline abusive relationships I chose. Mm-hmm. Because if I didn't care about myself, then like it didn't really matter. But like they would keep me safe, and like we would get married and have kids, and like that's the answer. And then the codependency thing. And I think when I sort of met you before my last relationship, but when I entered into my last relationship, all of this stuff had been unearthed, and then there was like this dust cloud, and I was swirling in it, and like using plant medicine and other modalities to really work with the amygdala and make you feel safe, so you remember these subconscious memories. And we've spoken about plant medicine and MDMA and psilocybin and the use of these substances, which are profound and I think are going to heal many if they're used properly, and also quite dangerous if they're not. But when I showed up and I was in this dust cloud and I wanted love, and I also was not fully integrated in the space of like I am, and I was still hoping for a man to come and save me. And so I called in a beautiful man, but someone that there was a lot of codependency and enmeshment, because I didn't know any better at that point. And because I didn't feel safe yet, I needed someone to make me feel safe. And I really wanted to be with a man who could provide that safety in some ways, which happened, and whatever else. There's a lot of story with that. But in that story was also this pretty deep wounded attachment in me. And in our last session, when I was on your table, resistant to be on your table, on Valentine's Day, ironically enough, showed up, and probably was wearing red, I don't know, maybe pink. I think I smelled like red Gatorade. I was drinking a lot of red Gatorade Zero. Do you remember
right.
this? Mm-hmm. And I was like, there's something weird going on my gut. And you're like, you smell like cough syrup. And I'm like, nope. And I was like, I've been drinking a lot of powder and Gatorade. But you smelled it on me like from some weird snake thing that you, whatever. Anyways, so I'm laying on the table. It's Valentine's Day. It had been a couple days after I'd ran into my ex-boyfriend. Like everything was like very fresh. And we had spoken before I had entered your home this time that I really wanted to dive into attachment because it felt like in this part of my journey, I had really worked through a lot of trauma, a lot of traumatic memories, and building healthier boundaries and shedding a lot of things that I was carrying for my life. But the attachment part was really important. Can you tell me why? Because I think attachment is thrown around like in every sphere, but talk to me about attachment, how it shows up in your work.
Attachment theory is a theory that comes out of psychology. And again, I'm not a psychologist, but I work in the trenches. So I see these things. I see all the things that the psychologists talk about. And I end up making my own theories. And then I'm like, oh, somebody already wrote a book about this.
Better start reading again.
Or not, like I already figured this out. Like there's the same information is available to anyone who goes in there and just, really keeps doing it and doing it and doing it. But what happens, the way I first discovered it was I discovered that that a lot of trauma that someone comes in with whatever this complaint happens in childhood. That kid is in distress, and that kid needs to be held and nurtured. And so part of what I do is I track to whatever they brought in, to that smelly sock, and I find the kid that owns it. But what I started to realize is it can go back even further than a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old. It can go back to infancy. And that's what attachment theory is all about. Attachment theory is about if you didn't have at least one parent that could reliably soothe you, take care of you, nurture you, you're going to go into a certain amount of distrust about the world because you're in your mom's womb. Everything is completely provided for. And then you come out and you have to have that person show up now. You're not connected to them anymore. They have to come and show up and take care of you and hold you. And what's sort of horrible about the 60s, which was a little before when you were a kid, is there were a whole bunch of books by this guy named Dr. Spock that was like, don't pick up the child if it's crying. Just let it cry it out. Don't spoil the child. And there's a place where you're spoiling the child, but if a child is just in distress, why wouldn't you hold the kid?
Right.
Why don't we just soothe the kid?
Yeah.
And so what they found and through research has happened is that kids who weren't held and who haven't been nurtured, who haven't had reliable parenting, end up with what's called attachment issues or whatever, attachment problems. There's probably some other word for it, but and they're
fucked up.
Yeah, they're screwed up. But there's normal attachment where you were attached to normally, and you grow up, and because you were attached to normally as an infant, as a small child, you can attach to others in a healthy way. It's called a healthy attachment, and so you will know when it's time to let your friend go, your partner go, and when it's time to hold on. You will not push them away unnecessarily. You will not hold on to them too much. When there's unhealthy attachment, it can go two ways. It can go to what's called anxious attachment, where you're never going to let them go. And that comes with a lot of control and punitive sort of things, like I'm not going to let you go, I'm going to punish you if you go, and all that kind of stuff. Or there can be avoidant, where I'm not even going to get that close to you because you're going to leave me anyway, so I'm not going to connect, and I'm just going to keep you out here in a safe little place where I like you, it's fun to hang out with you, but I'm not going to let you get to me because I know it's only a matter of time before you leave. And then there's the anxious avoidant person whose parents were inconsistently there. And so they're like, I love you, go away. I love you, go away. I love you, go away. Those people are really confusing.
I'm so confused. I'm so confused all the time.
You loved me yesterday. You hate me today. Yes. So what's great is people who are anxious attachers find avoidance. And they go on this run where the avoidant runs and the anxious person runs after them. And they have this whole weird relationship. And so,
you're a witness to that for a long time.
I've seen this in lots of different ways. So this is the kind of thing that happens until we do the work. And it's workable. You can do the work of breaking all that down and seeing where it comes from and reestablishing your way of connecting, finding healthy ways. Try to bring yourself to a healthy attachment.
Well, so when I got on your table, I wanted to get into the attachment because I had left this relationship, but also like felt quite attached still to the story or the back and forth or the nonsense. And a lot of my previous relationship was like, running and being chased or, staying and waiting and all the nonsense. A lot of just fucked up attachment.
Yeah, and it was going both ways with you because sometimes he would be gone and you would be like, what happened? Where is he? Where is he? And then he would be there and you're like, I'm out, I'm running, this isn't going to work for me, I'm running. So you might have that anxious avoidant.
Both. All of it.
Yeah. But anyway, so yeah, you got on the table and, we were looking at why can't you let go? Because you were still holding on.
Right.
And you didn't want to still hold on. Mm-hmm. And you'd had some recent engagement, I think. And so
I showed up very confused. And I think when someone shows up, I miss you, I love you, and then, it just a lot of noise.
So there's a lot of energy, a lot of emotional energy in that, and what you brought, that was your smelly sock. I'm still holding on. Okay. I can't let go. Yeah. So we get you on the table, we start running energy. And what the energy does, and we haven't talked about this, is it reformats your soul. Your soul is an energy field. It's on the outside of your being, and it has all the information of who you are and everything you've been through. It imprints all the things that you've ever been through, good and bad, imprint on your soul. So when we run the Sami, the energy through your soul or through your energy field, it pops all that stuff. While we're doing breath work, which opens up your subconscious so that you can start to experience what's in that sphere of information, because you're just running in your little ego in your default mode network. This is what my story is, and this is who I am, and these are my personas, and this is my nice neat little package of who I am. But when you start to do the breath work and we start to run the energy, all that stuff starts to pop, and I lean into your energy field and I can start to read it. I can start to see what's going on, and so I will feed back, and it's not like I'm picking from a whole bunch of different things, like what should I pick from, because we started with the smelly sock. The thing that we want that's related to the smelly sock is going to pop, is going to come through, because we already set our intention. That's what we want information on.
Yeah.
So we started in, and I could tell it went way, 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 way back.
And I assumed, because from my intellect, I was like, oh, well, I'm 6 or 5 or whatever. But you were like, nope.
And this is the interesting thing about the work, is the ego wants to control the narrative. The ego wants to say, this is what the story is. I already know the story. I've already explored the story. I know it inside and out. How do I get more? How do I milk more out of that story? I know where we're going. We're going to that story. And I'm like, that's not actually where we're going. That's not who's popping through. What's popping through is somebody in a crib, somebody really young. Yeah. And you're like, what? And I'm like, yeah. And all of a sudden it came through to you, which is what happens. Is I just set the stage, and if it is a real thing, your body will respond and you'll be there. Yeah. If it's not a real thing, you'll be like, not really feeling it.
No, and I was in my crib, and I used to cry so hard. And I would cry so hard until I threw up, because then someone would come get me. Because from my parents' era, it was like, you let the kid cry. And that's how they self-soothe, and then they go to sleep. As opposed to like Gabor Mate's work, who says now, like, you don't let the kid cry. That's not what you do. You go get your kid. Kid needs to be held. So I'm in the crib, and I'm like, I catch back into this phase, and you energetically, and you held me, and I felt myself safe again, like, because you're working with subconscious energy to come back into this space of just feeling like so held, so safe, so seen, I want to say reattach, but how does that then work? Like, from that session, like taking it with you, like how is that I guess you're rewriting the soul's knowing, or?
Well, it's happening on several levels. One, you're soothing the infant, which is what it needed in real time. So you're resetting the nervous system, right? The nervous system is now going, oh, I don't have to be so hypervigilant. Somebody's coming. Because when you're a little kid, they're like dogs. They don't know if you're ever coming home again.
Right.
Right? They're just, I'm in the bedroom, I'm in here, and I don't know if I'm hungry or my pants are wet or whatever, and are you ever going to come back?
Yeah.
And so you hold the kid and you go, I hear you, I see you, I got you.
Right.
And the kid calms down because that kid is frozen in time, in fear, in trauma. So you let that kid thaw. And in so doing, the nervous system is starting to reset itself. The story is starting to be not so important. And then those grooves, I would say, in your soul start to not be so deep. It just starts to be one of the stories that happened. It's not what defines you. It defines you only until you let it go.
So in that definition, I think that something I've worked through with you, but it still hovers for me. You know, being this baby in this crib, and something we've spoken about is this fear of abandonment, of like someone the parent leaving, and you're in there crying alone or whatever else, and you've taken me this place of like, it's a primal fear. What happens if no one comes? And that takes me to, well, if no one comes, then you die, right? So in my past relationships, I think it has shown up in this way of like this fear of abandonment, of what happens. You become so attached to someone, and then all of a sudden, like, they're out or you're out. So like you said, it's this avoidant of like, I'm not going to get too close so that I don't get hurt and so that they can't leave me. So if I've always shown up as 1 foot in, 1 foot out, then like I can't get hurt.
Right. And you can't get into a relationship.
Right. And like a true relationship. But the irony, as you mentioned, is that if I'm showing up avoidant, then I'm going to call in someone anxious. So the more I lean out, the more he leans in. And we're seesawing back and forth. And as you noted, like we both showed up in both parts. Like we would shift. So like, how do you break that? Like just breaking that cycle, like granted the work that we've done, but is it just a constant reminder? Is it deeper than that, of like continuing to do the work of like this fear of abandonment? Or because I'm not sure, like until I'm in my next relationship, how it will show up. I think I've become so much more integrated in my own life, body, boundaries, like knowing, less living in fear or unworthy, that I hope I don't show up that way going forward. But you know, I think maybe it would be helpful for people to understand, once they know, you know, their habit or where they're coming from, like how do you break the pattern?
You reset yourself. You have to find your inner worth that is okay alone and together. And this is what psychedelics are really good for, is to help rewire the brain so it doesn't go trip into a primal fear when somebody leaves. So you can just go, I'm good. I've got the whole universe. I got Pachamama. I got my dog and my cat. I got, you know, my good friends. I got whatever it is. I'm going to make this. I'm going to be okay with this. That person, it's going to hurt. It's going to be sad if that person doesn't come back. But I've got this.
So interesting, because I didn't plan on going here, but with what you just said, and going back to Pachamama and me sleeping on the floor, and, you know, in my most recent medicine journey, I went into deep, deep attachment wound with my father. And in ayahuasca ceremonies that I've done a year ago, even though the second journey I did was just a year ago, I remember being born and how I saw, it was a journey really about unconditional love. And I didn't see my mom, but it came out of my mom. But the first thing that I saw was my dad just staring at me, like just in so much love. And I think that was me, like remembering, you know, my father's love, because I love my dad so much. And his focus growing up was providing for the family. So emotionally, he really was unavailable, but was available in the best way he could be as a father. An incredible father, financially and sturdy and everything else, but emotionally wasn't there. Anyways, given that was my memory of him staring, I needed to feel his love from an unconditional place, and I felt that last year. Fast forward to my journey last week, it was me going into this deep sadness of like, I'm your girl, I love you so much, like, where were you? I needed you. This attachment to the masculine, which I think was something I needed to work through so that I could understand my relationship my most recent relationship, because that also took me into this deep love for, you know, someone I was with, but also I think this pretty faulty attachment, you know.
And validation. I think we really want validation from our fathers.
Okay.
We really want validation from our fathers because they're the worldly one, you know. And not it's completely like that anymore, but they are daddy, you know. Like we want validation from daddy. We want daddy to think we're worthy. I want to go back to when I said you know psychedelics can help you find that. The real work is doing all the work, doing all the trigger work, doing all the work that you need to do to not hate yourself, not loathe yourself, so that you can go, I got you, little girl, I got you. But the psychedelics are there to help rewire your brain when you've done all that work. Because you can do all that work and still have hypervigilance.
Yeah.
And what the psychedelics do is they help rewire the brain, so now you're a whole system, now you're a whole being, now you can put yourself back together. You can hold that space. If daddy doesn't love you, if daddy doesn't value you, you can still go, I value me. Yeah. I know who I am. I know what I, you know.
And I think that's like this word integration, I think gets spoken about a lot, but that's really the work. It's integrating what you take from these psychedelic assisted therapies or the energetics, whatever it is, and like integrating in your everyday life. Like I wake up every morning, I'm like, hey babe, you look cute. Like, I mean, I talk to myself constantly. I get in bed and I love you and thank God and thank Pachamama and like really remember. And I also catch myself constantly if there's any negativity or judgment for others. Like I always come back to myself, and I think those are skills I've had to learn so that I can see the world through a clear lens. So I can see people through a clear lens, not from a wounded place. And I love that you mentioned, you know, the validation from the father, you know, because I finally really fully honor that for my whole life, I just wanted my dad to see me. And in my medicine journey, you know, I took him because I was feeling this just, I love you, Dad. I love you so much. Like, I'm your girl. Because I also see him now with my baby niece, and it reminds me of, like, baby Olivia. And he loves her so much. And she's so funny. She calls him, my dad's name is Michael. Michael, she's 2. Because she hears my mom call him Michael. Michael, when he walks in the house. So baby Kate, Michael. It's so cute. But I went into this space and I love him. I love you so much, Dad. I love you so much. And I texted him, I love you so much. And he's like, are you okay? Because like it's the middle of the afternoon. And I'm like, yeah, I just was thinking about you and I love you so much. And he's like, you know, I'm always here for you. And I know that now. And I also know that he always was, just not in the way I needed him to be. So it was almost this full circle moment of like, there's so much sadness there for me. And also reverence for him, because he really put himself in whatever position he could to be the best he could. And truth be told, it fell really, really short for me emotionally. And I think the sadness was a lot of my relationships with men have been as a byproduct of needing to be seen by my dad. And the coolest part about that is that I had a conversation about this with my mom, and my mom really heard me. And it was really like this full circle moment of just humanity, you know, just unconditional love, even if it wasn't available in the way that I needed it to be, because there was a lot of missteps and left turns, you know, and trauma. But at the end of the day, it's like really knowing that not only did they have me, but I have me, and I know you have. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
To just, yeah. I was going to just, you know, ask one more question further into the attachment thing. So back to this, like, really knowing who you are and what you have and not needing someone else to validate, because I think a lot of issues come from relationships where the person needs to be needed or otherwise, and it creates really fucked up attachments. So what would be, I mean, I know you mentioned, like, really knowing and honoring yourself, but beyond that, like, advice for someone who feels like they can't get it right. Is it to go in, or, you know?
Yeah, it's to go in. I mean, it sounds cliche, but it's about self-love.
Yeah.
When you can accept yourself, warts and all.
Right.
Then you can show up. And then it's about, I accept myself. Do you accept me? Like, do you accept yourself enough to accept me?
Right. in all of our gore and blood, without our masks on.
If you need me to be some trophy,
yeah,
whatever for you, so you feel better about yourself, this isn't going to work because I'm not going to be able to be that for you.
Yeah.
Do you feel okay about yourself already? So you can just meet me as who I am instead of who you need me to be, so that you feel better about yourself.
I love that. I think that you've been so honorable in reminding me that at points when I've been confused around decisions. It's like just accepting someone where they are. Because I think so often we fall in love with someone's potential.
Yeah.
And as opposed to just who they are as they are. And we fantasize about what life could be.
Yeah.
So all in all, back to where we started, as this show is called Everything You Need Is Inside. What does that mean to you?
It means just that. It means that's what you're unearthing. In the Andean tradition, I think we've talked about this, you have an Inca seed. You have this place right in your solar plexus, right underneath your chest, that is your full potential, the full potential of who you are. And we would say it's your spirit, it's your divinity. It is like your Intel chip. It's fully loaded with your individuality, with who you're going to be. And it's about unearthing that. It's about getting all the trauma and wounding out of the way so that can express itself, so you can be that, so you can love that, knowing it's not going to be you. I'm not going to be Olivia Young. It's just not going to happen. I'm going to be Christina Allen, and I'm going to find my best way of loving Christina Allen. So everything I have is inside, and everything you have is inside. And the work is to chip away at all the delusion, at all the, all the ways we shortchange ourselves, limit ourselves, all the unconscious things that programs that undermine ourselves, and to come into that place of, okay,
this is me.
This is me. Yeah. I'm going to do the best I can with what I got. I got this run on the planet. Who knows if we have more, if we've had more. You can argue either way. But in any event, you got this lifetime. We know that. What are you going to do with it? You got to be you, and you got to get rid of all the things that trip you up. And the things that are tripping you up are in here.
Right.
You have to stop putting them out there. You have to stop, making them about those other people. Because those other people are just doing their own thing too.
Right.
And they are not trying to trip you up usually. And if they are, then they're a pain in the butt.
Right. They're probably just thinking about themselves.
Yeah. So everything you have is inside. It's a great tell.
Yeah.
I mean, tagline, it's a great, yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you for all of your work, for continuing to show up as a light in this world and holding space for people that need it. And being who you are, because I love you so much, and I'm so grateful to have met you in this realm. Yeah. So where can people find you now that everyone should find, no, because then you're going to be busy, but too busy. Where can people find you, Christina Allen?
The easiest way is my website, AustinShamaniccenter.com.
Okay.
I'm not big on picking up the phone because I talk to people all day long. So
do not call her.
Don't call me. But you can email me, and I have an assistant who's very good at interfacing, so that I can just do what I do best.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Just being you.
Yeah, just Tiffany. I'm going into the deep end with you. I'm not a very good small talker. That's why I don't go to cocktail parties. I'm gonna go to the deep end, like when you were 5, this happened. So don't.
I should probably stop going to cocktail parties or random bars when that's the conversation, and then people are like, I gotta go. I'm like, okay, bye. I do too. So thanks for tuning in. Thank you.
It's my honor. I'm so proud of you, all the work you've done. Absolutely.